Today we are going to be covering values. Now, what do I mean when I say values? Well, I basically mean the lightness and the darkness of an object that we draw. Since we see objects and understand objects because of how light or dark they are, value is of incredible importance to any sketches that you do. To many of you, you'll simply know it as the shading, but it goes a bit deeper than that. Not only do we have to cover the darkness of the object, we also have to cover the lightness of the object. And that can be a little trickier to include, so let's just start with a basic example here. So I'm going to draw us a cube, and with any luck, it'll be a decent one. And we see here, although we generally recognize this as a cube, it's missing a certain sense of structure and depth that we may see in other objects. So what we're going to do here, and now for the Photoshop users here, all I'm really doing is I'm lowering the opacity down to, let's try 40%. We're going to keep this simple. Opacity settings and Photoshop settings are a huge minefield that you can potentially get into when you're learning how to blend appropriately. But for this subject, we're just simply covering the notion of value, so we're going to keep it relatively simple. So, and again, you don't have to be using Photoshop for this tutorial. It is purely, this is essentially an any medium tutorial. You could be doing this with oil paints, pastels, a biro, whatever you've got your hands on. So, okay, so when we apply shadows, we essentially consider a light source. We're going to skip that for the moment. I'm just going to show you a very basic version of it. So when we say shading, we are essentially talking about, well, this side here is darker than this side here. And then this side here is darker, but then if we apply another layer of shading, we see we essentially have 3 levels of darkness here. So, and it helps us establish. So we can pretty much assume from what we're looking at here that there's a light source kind of coming in from this direction. So it's hitting here, it's not really getting to this side here, but it's getting a little to this side here. So maybe it's a bit more like this as well. So first off, how do you generate values? Well, we'll cover that first because without it, everything else that comes next won't really flow so much. So the best way to kind of learn this is via the gradients box. Now, when you're building up your shading, you want to not press hard. It can be very tempting to go right from the start, and if you imagine this as big thick pencil, just going in there like that and trying to apply the shading, often you'll end up making it too dark. It's better to start off with a light approach and build up. So again, I'm going to knock this down to, let's say, 20%. So what you want to do first is, if you want to just quickly draw yourself in a little table like this, and if you just imagine a few quick lines here, it doesn't have to be smart in any real way. We're just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep. And again, if you want to start off light or how you want, you basically, the aim of the exercise here is to essentially build in your levels of values. So you start off with the first box, make sure you leave that clear. So next box, you just shade that in. And as you can see, it's a bit darker than next box. And what I tend to do is I tend to shade with the same level of strength each and every time. And then you do it a second time on that second box. So as you can see, a little bit darker. And what are we on now? We're on 3. So as you can see, each time, I'm just doing this nice and quick. You don't need to worry too much about filling in the whole box, just the general point of it. Am I on 3 there? No, I think I need one more. Yeah, one more. 1, 2. And then the final box, just make this as dark as you can. It's the very bottom box, so you may as well just try and get as much black in there as possible. And you can see this is how we essentially build up. And this pretty much works for any medium that you use. You start off light and you repeat the same level of lightness on top of it multiple times. And you can slowly build up the values from that. And the question that usually comes after this is, what type of shading should I be putting on? How should I be applying these values to my shapes? So we'll start off afresh here, and we'll start off with a sphere, and we're just going to be imagining a single point light source. Now this is usually the way you want to start it off, so there are more complex light sources, and we'll be getting into those later in the video. But when you begin, just a single point of light source is a good way of going about it, just to get your understanding going. And for a lot of cases, you can easily just default to this without having to worry about more complexities. So again, I'm just going to knock the opacity down here. So when you start applying value to objects, you generally want to picture where your light areas are and where your dark areas are. So the light areas are going to be somewhere here near the top, and the dark areas are going to be somewhere down here. Now it's important to note here that when you're shading, usually the entire area starts off with a default shade. So it's less about applying shade in general, but more both giving shade and taking shade away. So when we start off, it's often a good idea to literally cover your entire object in like the mid-tone of the shade that you're wanting. And then you can build up from there, rather than starting from a pure white perspective. It's a case of, you're literally, like, if you do it from there, you'd be starting as if everything was completely light, and then slowly making it darker. Better to start somewhere in the middle, and either make it lighter or make it darker. So, if you're doing something like with a pencil, you can, like, rub out to make the light, and do extra layers for the dark. If you're using something like Photoshop, it's easier just to simply rub out appropriately. We're going to work on building up the shade of this area first. So if we just imagine again, here is where the point of the light is hitting, and we can just generally start working our way from there. And now bring it out a little. And we can see we're not going to waste time with blending or anything like that here, but you can start to see where the shade of the object is appearing. And we make it darker here. And you could usually smooth out these areas here. You can use what's known as blending to kind of make it like merge into itself a little better. But we're not going to really bother with that here. So we've generated what's known as the mid-tone shadow area here with a bit of what's known as the core shadow. So that's the darkest part of the object. That's the part where the light definitely doesn't get to. Now, you may notice that what I'm not doing is colouring down here and making this exact area the most dark part, the darkest part. And that's because that usually ends up not being the darkest part. If you get an item and just kind of look at it, you'll realise that there's often a tiny bit of light still there where you would expect it to be darkest. So, and that's what's known as the reflected light area. So that's as light is bouncing around, often light, because normally, especially since you don't normally have a single light source, you'll find that light will be bouncing all over the place, and usually a bit of light will be hitting back here and making this just a little bit lighter. So you'll also find you've got the area here known as the highlight. That's the part where the light just naturally is. And you'll see, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove a bit of the mid-tone there. So you see, we've got the mid-tone shadow area. Well, we've got the mid-tone area, we've got the mid-tone more shadowy area, we have the core shadow, and we have the reflected light, followed by the highlight part at the dip. So, and then finally, to cast it all off, we are going to have the cast shadow. Now, the cast shadow is what gets generated by the sphere itself. And because this is a simple 1.1, we can usually just blag this one as best we can. So I'm just going to quickly draw a circle here to give the impression of a cast shadow. Now, this one's not going to be perfect. We're going to show you how to make better shadows in a moment, but this will just give you the general idea. So when you're creating an object, these are the general areas you want to be thinking about. You want to be thinking about your midtones area, your core shadow area, your highlight, the lightest part, the reflected light, the light which bounces back from other sources. So this will be the idea of like, there's not only light here, maybe somewhere off in the distance there's a bit of sunlight here, and that's causing that. And then finally, the cast shadow, the area of darkness brought onto other objects. Note, this isn't just the ground, this is other objects. So this could, in theory, be like the roof of a house, or even another person's body, and you would develop the cast shadow over it. And these rules generally apply with any other forms that you may be using. So you could apply a similar example to a pyramid. I just quickly draw one up. If we just quickly imagine that this light source is actually beaming upon the side of the pyramid that we can't actually see. So essentially, if you imagine there's this one on this other side here, that's where that's hitting. So most of the light is going on there. So that leaves these two sides being areas that have a core shadow. So again, if we just quickly apply these. These are the areas that get the most darkness because there's less light hitting on them. So, but you may still find, because of the way the light is bouncing around, there is a bit of reflected light hitting both of these sides here. And then if we knock it up, you'll find you'll get your casted shadow as well against the ground. So this will be the basics of value forms, and I would definitely recommend having a play around with these. Try to get the idea of where light would be bouncing off an object and what would not be getting the light. But now let's quickly move on to the two different types of light source you can usually get. And they are basically the local light source and what's known as the solar light source. So local light source is similar to the one-point light source that we just did, but it's more of a cone field. So you've got to imagine if you have your little light source here just minding its own business, and you have a cube. That light source isn't just going to be making a single point of light. No, in fact, it's going to be making a lot of different points of light. Especially if it's something like a desk lamp or a street light. It's going to be basically making these rays which point out in all directions. And these are going to be affecting your cube. So what I usually recommend here is if you generally get your idea of where your point of light is, and what you want to do, often, in fact, let's just do this in another color to just kind of help symbolize how this would be a sketching line that you do. This is more of a construction line than it is the actual lines you want to be using. And you imagine where that light is hitting. One important thing to note here is the points that it will definitely be hitting even outside of the picture here. So one other extra line will be from this point here, because as this is a cube that exists in 3D space, this line here will actually be facing, to some extent, the light source itself. So that would also go off in that direction. And from here we get a pretty good idea of what areas are going to be covered by the shadow area. And that means we can sort of, I'm not going to go for exact measurements at this stage, but this will give you a general idea of it. We can see that the cast shadow appears here. And so now we have the idea of which area is bathed in the most dark. And because this area here is just a little more in the dark than that area there, the reflective, if you take into account the reflective light, we can just apply a bit more shade on here. And I've ended up doing this in colors, but if you just imagine that this is all in grays for the moment, we get an idea of how everything's being displayed. So we can see here how local light essentially creates the shadowed area for us, creating the proper cast shadow shape. Finally, we have what's known as the solar light source. So the solar light source is a case of, yeah, you may have realized that there's not just the local light sources, but there's also the one from the sun itself. And essentially, points of light which are essentially so far away that they can't really create a arcing scale like this. We don't have a light source itself that we can just simply draw on the board and just say, right, that's where our light is. So with these types of light sources, we use parallel lines. And if you imagine basically, this will be one of those situations where if you're ever thinking, well, how do I think of the light source? Because the light source is all the way off in the distance. Like, it's a case of, here is the sun and here is your painting. But unfortunately, at this point, when you get into where your painting is, the painting itself is far too big to even begin to have where that sun is. So that light source will be coming in as parallel lines. So I say parallel lines as opposed to arc lines. And if, again, we draw another cube. we can see the difference that these parallel lines have on our cube. So the light comes down straight like that, as well as against this line and even this line. And we can already see that this is beginning to create a somewhat different shape than what we may be used to. So, a somewhat different shape than what we had in the local light, at least. So, and with the lines drawn, we can just fill in the dark area here. I'm not going to waste time creating the midtones and the core shadow of the actual object itself. Knowing the difference between the local light source and the solar light source is usually best for the cast shadows more than anything else, but they can also be used to help generally signify the areas where the core shadows and the midtones would essentially be. But for now, this will essentially do so. And as we can see here, we've ended up with a cast shadow that's ever so slightly different from the one created via the local light source. So that's a quick intro to the idea of values, and values can be insanely complex. As you get more into it and with more complex shapes, you essentially apply these basic fundamentals onto those more complex shapes, and from it you essentially get a lot of different figures going on. So you'll often find that when you get into a lot more figure drawing, and especially in a digital light, you'll often end up handling a lot of your values first before you even apply things like color. So getting a shape of values is quite a good skill to have. Hope you enjoyed that. We'll see you in the next video.